But nonetheless, let's get into our topic of Balaam. And I'd love to, address that question that's probably in all of your minds, but you're all too polite to actually say, why are we studying a man like Balaam? Like, is there actually enough to study it for a whole week? Like, what are we going to learn from this shadowy character who's tucked away in the back chapters of the book of Numbers? Does some weird and unusual things, has a donkey that talks. I mean, it's not even a proper 5 or 6 litre truck, but rides this donkey. Get it? Bear with me. I hope you'll see why. What can be learnt? I'm going to suggest a lot can be learnt, and it's not just negative lessons. But I want to flick that around, and answer that question by asking you a couple of questions. And I'd love to get some feedback from you as the audience. How does the story of Balaam begin? How does his life begin? How do we perceive the man? He's a prophet. The Bible calls him a prophet. Is he evil to the bone? Is he intrinsically always bad? Or was he somebody who was potentially sitting at one of these tables?
He's a brother.
He was a brother. He had a strong relationship with Yahweh. I want to prove that to you. I want to show that to you. And that's the start of the story of Balaam, that he was a man like you and I, touched with all the same emotions, desires and struggles. Yahweh worked with him closely. He lost his way. So the point of the study is, how does that happen? What can we learn from his life? That's what I'm hoping to gain by this study. How does the story end? Not well. It ends with a sword, which is ironic. That he dies by the sword, which is exactly what our Lord says should happen to the way of Balaam. He dies in Numbers chapter 31. We're going to connect the end of the story, which a lot of people don't connect the whole story and put it together. And I want to show you the end result of his life. And the last question I'd love to be able to share is up front to set the scene, or the tone maybe, of how we should understand this story of Balaam. And it addresses the question of, why would we spend a week talking about Balaam? Does anyone know how many times Balaam's referenced in the Bible outside of his actual narrative story? Have a guess. 6. It's a good guess. It's a good spiritual guess. But it's more. Any higher takers? 15, you win. No. It's actually 12 times Balaam is referenced in the Bible. He's mentioned by name outside of his actual story. And there's a couple of printouts of all those references here if you'd be interested in it. He's referenced by name 12 times by other books in the Bible, including our Lord, to reference how important his life is, how much can be learnt from his life example. And so I hope that validates why we'd spend the time to study his life. If he's referenced 12 other times in the Bible, and exactly what happened in his life is repeated down through history, and we'll develop that a bit more in a minute, then there's a lesson that we too, in the final generation, can learn from his example. So I hope that validates a little bit why we would study this story. The other reason is because Balaam has an ass that speaks. Now, in your minds, you may be able to think of the last time that the Bible talked about an animal having a deep and meaningful conversation with a believer. It's in Genesis 3. It was a very meaningful conversation, and it laid out for us as brothers and sisters the principles of the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And they were the same problems that Balaam faced. And that's a story that we can leave in the Garden of Eden with the first people, the first story of the Bible, and we can leave it there and say it's foundational. It's a first principle. Well, the story of Balaam teaches us those same foundational principles, but for a generation who is standing on the edge of destiny. They're standing on the edge of the promised land. They could stand there and see that land. The nation of Israel has wandered for 38 years. And they're about to enter the promised land. And 24,000 of our brothers died because of him. It's the same lesson that we have to learn as we stand on the edge of destiny. If we believe our Lord is about to return, those same lessons need to be learnt in our life. And I guess that's what I'm hoping this week we'll be able to get across, is that sometimes what can seem to be far off is blurred by the things that are very close to us. The importance of not giving up our vision for the things that we think we want in life now, but keeping our vision clear and keeping it focused so that we don't give up in the small day-to-day decisions of life and keep our priorities right. Now, you can think that this subject is a little bit negative, and I guess on face value, it is a little bit of a negative subject. I will do my very best to keep it positive. But when did you last hear a study on a negative character? It's not very often, is it? But the lessons we're going to see in Balaam's life is exactly the same as Judas, for example. He was a man who was so close to the Lord, one of the 12. Got the best teacher you could ever have. And he made the same choice of having the here and now and valuing it as more important than what we want most of all, which is a true relationship with our Father. And it's the same lesson that we see in lots of other stories, and I hope that you'll be able to pick some of them up. People like Simon the Sorcerer, same approach. You'll see a lot of them as you read your Bibles. But it can be turned around to the positive, and if maybe you know the story of Balaam well, and maybe if you're familiar with the story of Balaam and you feel like you've got it under control, please have a think about Paul the Apostle. Because he was a man who did the dead opposite of Balaam. He went down the same journey that Balaam went through, literally the same journey in the opposite direction. And his journey led him to Christ, and Balaam's journey led him and 24,000 others to oblivion. And they're the simple stories that our scripture has for us. There's a power that we can take away and put into our lives to change us for good. Because the truth is, as our Lord said, we can't have both. We cannot have both worlds. And the positive part of this story is we'll see the patience that God has with us, as he had with Balaam, as he worked with Balaam to discourage him from going his way, the way of Balaam, as Jude picks up and talks about to us. God works in his life to discourage him from that, and he does it to us too. And we've got to be able to identify that. We've got to be able to see that and respond to those callings and the way God works in our life. So the first thing I was hoping to do this morning was to be able to highlight to you that Balaam is potentially sitting at one of the tables like you or I could be this morning. Just like he could be in one of the ecclesias back at home in Perth. He's a brother sitting in the ecclesial hall, struggling with the pressures of what's right there in front of him, of the here and now, the today issues, in contrast to keeping his mind on the future. So what I want to clarify for us is that Balaam was a prophet. He was a worshipper of Yahweh. And we're told that in verse 8, we're told that in verse 13, we're told that in verse 18 and verse 19 of the chapter that we read, Numbers 22, we're told that he worshipped Yahweh. Now the question might go through your mind, Yahweh, that's a unique name that we as the Christadelphians, almost above all other churches, have an understanding of. How did he know that name? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want us just to pick up on this for a second. Verse 18. If Balak, the king of Moab, was to offer to Balaam a house full of silver and gold, Balaam says, I know what's right. I can't go against the word of Yahweh, my Elohim. He's a man who understood God. He understood the qualities and the characteristics of our God, who had a relationship with God such that he could, in a business conversation with the colleagues that he works with, openly communicates that his priorities should be with Yahweh, his Elohim. He took it personally. But he still failed. We continue looking at the other references here in chapter 23. What am I trying to highlight? Don't discard this man because we know the end of his life. He sat in the ecclesial hall and he struggled with the same things that you and I do. He just chose some bad decisions, and the consequences were eternal. Verse 8 and verse 9, let's have another read of that and just carefully and just see and understand a little bit more about this man Balaam and his relationship with Yahweh. The elders of Moab and Midian in verse 7 have come down to meet Balaam. And they've brought a whole load of money with them to convince him to come. And his response to them in verse 8 is, stay here tonight and I will bring you back word, whatsoever the word is that Yahweh my God speaks to me, I'll bring it to you in the morning. And so the princes of Moab stayed overnight with Balaam. Now I ask you, brothers and sisters, do you have that relationship with God? There's a confidence in this man that tonight when he goes to bed, he can ask God for an answer about what he should do next week in his life. And he is confident that he'll get an answer. You could say he's bluffing. We'll have a read of what verse 9 tells us. And God came to Balaam. And God answered Balaam. And he gave him a very clear answer about what he should do. And he said no. But I want us to, we'll talk about that in a minute, but what I want us to focus on is the confidence that this man has in his relationship with God through prayer. Now that confidence doesn't come overnight. That confidence comes by repeated relationship and answers to his prayer in the past. That's how we build confidence. It's one of the biggest things that we struggle with prayer, isn't it? That we seemingly have no answers from God. This man believes that God will answer him and will give him answers. And that's not the only time. In verse 7 and verse 8, we get the same thing in verse 19 and 20. It's repeated. Balaam again the next time says the same thing. Stay with me tonight and I'll ask God again what he has to tell me. And again, God appears to him and gives him an answer. What I'm trying to reinforce to you is not to discard this man, but to relate to him. Because I'm jealous of that relationship. I wish I had answers like that. I wish I had that level of confidence that God will answer my prayers, but there's still doubts in my mind often. Will God give me an answer? Will I have to wait to learn from hindsight? But Balaam, in his very business decisions, even the mundane decisions of life, turns to God for answers, to Yahweh, his God. So we come back to the next question then that we had before of how did Balaam learn who Yahweh, the God of Israel, was? And I throw that open to you. Is there anybody who can tell me how Balaam knew who Yahweh was? Well, I'll give you direction. How about where did Balaam come from in verse 5? In verse 5, we're told that Balaam came from a place called Pethor, which is by the Euphrates River. That's a good hint. In the land of Amor, some translations might present. Does that ring any bells in our minds? Who met Yahweh by the Euphrates River and was told to leave his family? Abraham was in Haran. And just south of Haran is the city of Pethor, approximately 15 kilometres maybe from Haran. And that's where Balaam came from. He has an understanding of Yahweh. And he has an understanding of Yahweh's purpose and the way he works. And he has an intimate relationship with Yahweh in prayer, just like Abraham did too. We're going to see some characteristics that are similar to that of the Abrahamic family in Balaam. And I think we can take confidence that that's Balaam's heritage. That's where he comes from. We could call it a good, strong Christadelphian centre of ecclesial life. I just wanted for a second challenge our minds to think about who else God was working with at this time and that knew Yahweh, the God of Israel. Can anyone think of any other Bible characters who are familiar with Yahweh at this time chronologically through the Bible? Jethro, wonderful. Moses' father-in-law Jethro lives down, if we take the map down, he lived down here in Midian. Midian, interesting, that's the nation that we're going to come against. Jethro is a Midianite, and he understood Yahweh. He worshipped Yahweh. So Yahweh is working with people outside of just the nation of Israel. Because at this time, historically, the nation of Israel is down here in Egypt. So how does a man who's up there know about Yahweh? Well, that's because of the family link. But God's working with much more than just the nation of Israel. That's encouraging for us that he can be working with even Australians or Canadians who aren't part of the family of Israel naturally, but are spiritually. Job. Job is dated chronologically about this same period of time. And he had a number of friends who also knew the God of heaven. Melchizedek is at the same period of time. God is working with people outside of just the family of Israel and bringing them to a closer relationship and understanding with him. It's encouraging for us to think about that, because if God would work with a Balaam, he'll work with an Australian or a Canadian as well in exactly the same ways to help us. Let's hope we don't follow that path. Now, Balaam has a reputation. And the reputation is quite strong. We're going to see that reputation is in verse 6. Let's actually read that verse again, get the context of it. We have the king of Moab, Balak, who says to Balaam, "Please come down and curse this nation for me. They're very powerful, and I need you to help me to prevail against them so that I can conquer them." And here's his motive. Here's what his reputation is built on. The last part of verse 6. It is because I know that the people you bless are blessed. And I know that the people that you curse will be cursed. And surely there's an echo. That's Abraham. That's the blessing that God gave to Abraham when he was in Ur of the Chaldees over here. That's the blessing that God repeated to Abraham. I will be with you, Abraham, and I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse them that curse you. Balaam has a reputation that has gone ahead of him 500 kilometres or more, based on the facts that he can apply the principles of the Abrahamic faith in his life, and it can have an effect on other people for good or for bad. Just think about that. That's the man we're dealing with. He has a reputation of being able to apply the Bible principles for good or bad. And sadly, he used it for bad. But just grasp the scale of that reputation, that it's internationally known. It's travelled 500 plus kilometres, and kings don't pay big dollars for backyard magicians to come and do tricks. This man's reputation must be strong. And it was a massive problem. And the problem is the same as the problem that we have today, whether it be in the churches or whether it can be in our ecclesias, and I've seen it back home, and that's what's driven me to this study, so it's a very personal thing for me. So forgive me if I get a little emotionally attached to it. But we have that. Where brothers or sisters are driven by ulterior motives. And for Balaam it was money and reputation. It motivated the man to go around the world and to leverage his understanding of the Bible for personal gain. It's very easy to look at the churches and go, yeah, well, there's the mega churches with their pastors that go around in private jets. But it happens in ecclesial life too. Because we're touched with the same lusts of the flesh, of the eyes, and the pride of life that drives us to make dumb decisions in our life. And quite simply, to prioritise those things of this life above God's ways. And I want to prove that to you now. I'll just demonstrate that to you. Verse 7 highlights to us that the elders of Midian and the elders of Moab understood that. They could look at Balaam and they could see that there's a man who has a religious reputation, but he's motivated by money, because they left Midian and they came with loads of cash in their pockets, ready to motivate that man, because they understood that if he saw the gold, he would be more inclined to go. And so they came with the rewards, or the fee, as some translations will put it, the fee of divination. And it's in their hands. You know, they had absolutely no intention of giving that to Balaam, and that is proven to us by going to chapter 24 and at verse 11. It makes it very clear that Balak has not paid Balaam as yet. He says, no, I can't honour you. I can't pay you for your services because you have not delivered. So that was merely in their pockets for the purpose of giving Balaam a glimpse. Now, I hope that brings an echo back in your mind too to the family of Abraham. Because there's a man called Eliezer who went looking for a wife for his master, and on his camels he was loaded with gold. And the family that lived up there had a member of their family who was so impressed by that gold that it drove him and motivated him to behave wrongly. Can I get something? Who was that man? Laban. See the echoes? There's a family trait that's following through. Those that Abraham was told to leave your family and your kindred for your good, Abraham, and come to a land that I will show you. And so Abraham did. Now you may say, Jared, you've made a lot out of verse 7, and I have. I'm going to prove to you in a second that there's a lot of games going on in this chapter. There's a play going on between the two parties. That's the next thing we'll look at. But let's just look at the way the New Testament explains the story of Balaam. It's not my opinion, this is the divine perspective. The divine perspective is given to us by Peter, and it's given to us by Jude. And it's the same message. that Balaam forsook the right way. He knew the right way. He was going the right way, but he forsook it. He turned his back and he said, I want that. And he chose to go in that direction. Let me explain that more. They're now going astray. In Peter's time, as they were in Jude's book that he wrote as well, they followed the way. We'll see that all the way through chapter 22 and chapter 23 about the man Balaam. The way of Balaam ends in destruction. He's the son of Bosor. And the problem in Balaam's life is that he loved the wages of unrighteousness. And we know that the wages of sin is death. But this man didn't just by accident fall into the wages of sin leading to death. This man loved the wages of sin. And that is the word agape. And that is a very unusual use of the word agape. What's our understanding of that word agape? There's three types of love, right? Eros, phileo that we have between our brothers and sisters, a strong, compassionate, caring love to each other. And then there's agape, it's the pinnacle. It's the type of love that God shows to us. How do we describe agape love? There's two qualities that we normally talk about. There's a sacrifice. Agape love has a sacrificing aspect to it where it's willing to give up something for someone else. Keep that in mind. What's the other aspect of agape love? Unconditional. It's unconditional, sure. In one way, it's unconditional. Let's be careful about taking that too far, but yes, you are right, it's unconditional. Let's think about the intellectual aspect of the sacrifice. It's not like phileo, where it's because there's a strong friendship or a blood relationship. That's what it's built on, which isn't necessarily bad. But agape love is someone who intellectually says, that is good, and I'm going to choose that above this, and I'm willing to sacrifice this because that is good. And that is what Balaam did. He saw a pile of cash, gold, whatever it was, and he intellectually, and we're going to see that through chapter 22 and chapter 23, he made an intellectual decision to choose that above what he wanted most of all, which was his relationship with God. And that's the sad part. But that's the way the Bible, God's divine perspective, summarises Balaam for us. But that's not where Balaam started, but that's where he ended. Now, I mentioned to you that there's a level of... I should just check that we're up to date. I've missed my notes a little bit. There's a level of games that are going on between Balak and Balaam. And I want to demonstrate that to you by some simple, careful reading of the chapter. And this is how it happens. Because when the world promises us something, it never tells us the full story. The world never promises to us that the wages of sin is death. It says the wages and the pleasure that you'll get from a night out with us will be a great time. Come, let's share a few drinks. Let's go out for a big night together. It'll be grand. Have you ever had somebody from work say to you, let's go out for a few drinks. Let's get a lot of drinks under our belt, so much so that we wake up in the morning with a headache and we vomit. Have you ever had someone promise that? But in our younger years, surely we've heard of those in their early formative years who have literally found themselves vomiting by being fooled by the promise that a big night out and the abuse of alcohol, not that I'm not saying alcohol is wrong, please understand, I'm not saying it is intrinsically wrong in itself, but the abuse of it, and taken too far, is wrong. And it's not good. But the world never tells us that. The world says it'll be a great night out, so we'll have some great memories leaning over the bowl. No, they never say that. The world never promises that money won't buy you happiness. They say the world says that money will buy you happiness. The world never tells us the truth. The world promises this illusion, and we've learnt that. As brothers and sisters, we've chatted differently to the teens, and we've talked about some of these things. They seem to be grasping it. Please have that conversation with them. A couple of them came and talked about it afterwards, of realising, hey, these are the decisions of life, and they are. So chat with them if you have the opportunity, please. We've learnt some of those lessons, but we can still be fooled. Because what's right here in front of us and the pressure of what's facing us on a day by day can loom so large that we lose our perspective on what we want most. I want to demonstrate that to you in the chapter. The chapter began in verse 1, 2 and 3 with a bit of a historical setting where the writer of Numbers is telling us that the children of Israel set forward and they pitched in the plains of Moab by Jordan at the point where they could look over into the promised land. And Balak, who was the son of Zippor, saw Israel and what they'd done to the Amorites just south of Balak, how they'd conquered them and how they'd won all the battles and things were going incredibly well for the nation of Israel. He saw that and he was scared. He was dead scared of the children of Israel. Well, Balak sends a message to Balaam and says, there's a people, just a tribe, some translations put it as. There's just a group of people who have come out of Egypt, and I want you to come and curse them. And what you'll find is in the rest of the chapter 22, the nation of Israel is never mentioned. And Balaam is never told that he's coming to curse the nation of Israel. He's only told that he's coming to curse a people. Come and curse this people. Or some translations would say a tribe, and I've forgotten the other words, it slipped my mind. Come and curse this people. And what Balak is doing is hiding the reality of sin. Call sin what sin is. Balaam, will you come down and curse the children of Israel, the children of the God of heaven? What do you think Balaam would have said? No, I can't do that. But Balaam is fooled by the world, who tells him half the story and doesn't say it as it is, and just says, come out for a good night. Not knowing the full story of what he's going to do. Now, if I could take that principle one step further, and you're going to see it come out in our stories, particularly tomorrow, a little bit further. It teaches us, as brothers and sisters, a really important principle. We can have a relationship with God. We can have an understanding of who the God of the Bible is. But unless we understand the purpose of God, and that is to bring out of the nations a people for his name, as God was bringing Israel out of Egypt. And he wants us to be different to the world. He wants us to be changed. Unless we understand that true purpose, that God wants people who manifest him, who are like him, and we really understand the character of God, we can be fooled by the doctrines of the churches too. If we have just a simple, shallow understanding that God loves me just the way I am and everything's going to be wonderful, and don't understand his purpose, and don't desire to be conformed to his ways, and don't actively work on those things and apply it to our life, we'll fall into exactly this same trap that Balaam did, of not understanding and knowing that his family, his extended cousins that went down into Egypt, were going to be called out of Egypt and given that promised land. And so Balaam gets himself caught in a trap. And that's what we want to see in Numbers chapter 23. We're going to see that dawn of realisation come upon Balaam as he realises that he's been led into a trap. But it's too late. And that's the devastating part of the story of Balaam. So we need to learn that lesson for ourselves, that this world will happily, willingly blur the facts and the realities of sin to minimise sin and to say it's just a night out. No, they're the people of God. And we're called to be separate from that. And we need to be different. We need to apply our faith. Well, Balaam considers the offer in verse 8. He replied to them and he said, listen, stay here tonight and I'll come back to you with whatever Yahweh may speak to me. And so the princes of Balak stay with him for the night. And God came to Balaam in verse 9. And he asked Balaam a question. Who are these people? And they talk through that conversation in prayer. And God gives a very clear answer in verse 12 to Balaam. There's 3 points in verse 12 that are really important to grasp and to understand. There's 3 points which are, you must not go with them, full stop. Is there any misunderstanding what that means? Do not go with them. Now, in case Balaam thought they lived in a modern world where he could, by Zoom or some other remote way, cast a curse from Pethor down there to Edom, God also said, hey, you must not curse these people in case you thought you could do it remotely. You can't. Why? They're blessed. God tells him, God clarifies it, and what's more, God gives him a reason why he can't and shouldn't do that. That's critical to grasp. Because if we take God at his word, we've got to believe what verse 12 says. Don't go. Well, Balaam gets up in the morning and he says to the princes of Balak, go back to your land because Yahweh my God has refused to let me go with you. He says, I can't go. And you know what? It's a bit like a little boy might say to his friends, I'm not allowed to come and play today because Mummy said I can't. Now, the truth is, Mummy had other reasons, and that is that we're going to the meeting. But it only gives half the story, right? And as adults, we do the same thing too. Where were you last week? Oh, I went to Canada. No, I went to a Bible school and I learned about God. Let's be upfront and honest about it. Because imagine that. Imagine if Balaam said to Balak's servants, I can't go with you because I'm not allowed to curse those people. And I'll tell you why I'm not. Because God, my God, he's blessing those people. Do you think that those servants of Balaam would have responded in the way that they did by going back to their master and saying, Balaam says we can't go. And King Balak says, well, let's send more princes, more in number, more in influence, more in power with more money. And maybe that'll convince him. Do you think that Balak would have responded that way if he was told that? No, he wouldn't have. And the problem is that we do that all the time in life too. We play with temptation. And temptation typically comes into our life by a door that's just left open, just a crack. And those connections we have with people that are not good for us, we leave open. Or the opportunity to be invited to things that we know that we shouldn't go, we leave an opportunity for us to connect. And we play with those emotions, don't we? We just wrap it up sometimes in very pious words like, even if Balak was to give me all the silver and the gold that could fill his house, I couldn't disobey God. But you know, that gives an insight into the man himself. Because what he's done is he's put the two things that he values most of all against one another. He says a house, a palace full of silver and gold, or Yahweh my God. And what he's done is he's set those two things in contraposition. And he's told the world, a smart salesman, he's told them what really motivates him. And so the messengers, the princes of Balak, identify that wealth and influence that a king can provide to this man Balaam will have an impact on him. And so naturally, they come back with more of it in verse 16. Listen, they say, please don't let anything hinder you. We'll give you great honour. We'll give you absolutely anything that you want. Just come. Anyone had that offer at work? Name your salary. Just come. Oh, really? What's the expectation? What's the requirement? Do you want to own my Sunday morning as well as my Saturdays and my evenings? Do you want to own me? Or can I still do my 9 to 5 and spend my life where I really want to spend my life? You know, they're the issues that we face, aren't they? It's no different to a man who lived 3,500 years ago and rode a talking donkey. It's the same principles. And he fell for something, and it leaves us a lesson to learn from in our lives. So Balaam played with sin. You know, in verse 19, Balaam says, listen, the second time they came back to him and said, you sure that we can't offer you more honour and more wealth? It's like the second offer in an employment opportunity. You sure if we up it another 50 grand, you won't come? We'll pay for removal costs as well, and we'll place your children in school. Private schools, all good. Balaam's response is, listen, you're welcome to spend another night here with me, just as the other princes who came the first time did. And I'll go and find out if the Lord has anything else that maybe we can distort the truth a little bit to verse 12 to allow me to be able to go. And that's what he said. Is there something else that God has to say other than, don't go, don't curse them, I'm blessing them? How much clearer could you want it? But Balaam's like, let me find a verse that can justify what I want to do. Nothing's changed, has it? We do that. Well, I do that. Maybe you don't. They're the challenges of life. And this is what we're learning from this man's character. So temptation comes in a way by a door that's been left open by us, where we want to justify privileges and pleasures that we can enjoy in this life now. And the reality is they are merely the wages of unrighteousness. They don't lead us to God. They are innocent amusements, contrivances that just help us to forget who God is. But I want to ask you, who's playing who? Because Balaam's playing Balak, Balak's playing Balaam, and sometimes in life we think that we've got everything under control. We've got a lot of ducks in a line, you know, we've sort of got things organised. We know how we're going to play this game, and we think we've got our options are open and the balls are all in the air and we're managing life and all's good. We'll ask you, who's got this situation under control? This is so reassuring. God has this situation completely under control. Look carefully at the way it tells us. Sorry, no, that's next slide. Have a read very carefully of verse 9. Balaam in verse 8 has said that Yahweh might answer his prayer, and so the princes of Moab spend the night. And verse 9 opens with, and God came to Balaam. Wonderful! God came to Balaam. Who took the initiative? God came to Balaam. And what did God say? So picture an angel coming to Balaam, and he says, who? Who are these men that are staying with you, Balaam? Now, if Balaam had been up front and got on his knees and prayed to God and said, I've had some men who have come from Moab and Midian, and they want me to come down and curse a people, Yahweh, show me what I should do. Show me your way. Would the angel have said, who are those people who are staying with you? What it shows to us is that Balaam wasn't being up front. Because it's the angel that so typically as angels are, ask questions. Just like in the Garden of Eden. Who told you that you were naked? Who are these men at your house, Balaam? That's an opening question of a person who is trying to ask a person to open up. Isn't it? It's not confrontational, it's not judging, it's not anything. It's just a simple question. Who are these people with you? And so Balaam is forced to be open with his God. And I think what was happening was that Balaam may have been praying, but he's hedging. He's not actually addressing the real issues. Maybe he's rolling out prayer like he always did. The usual pattern, with hardly a thought or care for whether he's truly asking God to lead him in his day-by-day decisions. You know, brothers and sisters, the next is exactly the same in verse 18 and verse 19. Balaam says, "Stay here for the night, and I'll ask God if he's got a little bit more to tell me." And we get the same thing, that God appears to Balaam and addresses questions to him. And my translation starts with if. It's a question. If the men come to you. So angelic. Follow it through the Bible. Angels always ask questions. It opens the heart of the individual to be honest, to be truthful about the situation they're in. It's the same in Genesis. It's the same in the New Testament. Let's keep going. I just want to summarise the story of Balaam, just so there's no misunderstandings. I guess that's brought us far enough in our story this morning. If we go much further and we don't understand the end of this story, we're going to miss some of the details. So I just want to summarise for what I think is the last 5 or 10 minutes, the story of Balaam and how it goes. Numbers 22 that we've just been reading, Balaam's been called down by King Balak to come and curse Israel. So he's enticed to do that by money, and it's against God's will. We know the story. The angel meets him in the way when he's on his donkey. Numbers 23. Balaam prophesies good instead of evil. So he stands up to speak, and the words that come out of his mouth are blessings instead of cursings. That's Numbers 23 and 24. He keeps on trying for the 4th time and fails. So what he then does is changes his approach, and he gives some prophecies about the future in the rest of Numbers 24. Prophecies about Israel's glamorous future and Edom's distraction are what those prophecies are about. The problem is that means he fails to earn his reward. And Balak fronts him up and says, "Sorry, but your God won't let me pay you." It's funny the way that works. The people use our religion back on us. Your God won't let you do this, will he? No, I don't want to do that, should be our answer. But Balaam struggles. So we come to the end of chapter 24. And I want us to very clearly understand that 24 and at verse 25 ends with this verse here, and it's a different translation. Just for those that may be wondering, I am for this study using the NET translation. I did begin the study with the King James. It is my preferred translation of the Bible. The ESV is wonderful. The NET for this story just takes it to the next level. It's helped me grasp it. So all my markings are in this Bible, so we use this. This is the NET, and it says that Balaam rose up and he went and he returned to his place. And Balak went his way. And chapter 25 sounds like a whole different story about something completely different. It's not. Chapter 25 is the consequence of Balaam's actions behind the scenes. Please connect. And we're going to do that in our studies. But if you're not there on the 3rd or the 4th study, whenever we get to it, please understand that 24 verse 25 is connected to chapter 25. It doesn't, in a single verse, there's no reference to Balaam in chapter 25. But it's all about the outcome and the result that Balaam achieved. This verse makes it sound like Balaam went home to his place back in Pethor. He didn't. It sounds like Balak went back his way to his palace back home. The fact is, they both went back to the same, let's say, hotel. And they sat down and they figured out how they could corrupt the nation of Israel. They figured it out together. They concocted it, Micah tells us. We'll look at that verse later. And the result is that they brought a consequence upon the nation of Israel, that 24,000 brothers died as a result of what they concocted. How do we know that? Let me prove it to you quickly in case you don't get there, and in case, well, just simply so you know the facts from the beginning and you know the storyline. Chapter 31. It's a couple of chapters later in Numbers, and again, we don't necessarily connect it. But God comes to Moses after having spent the last few chapters numbering the nation of Israel from the 24,000 that died, renumbering them. Numbers 31, God says to Moses, listen, I want you to go and avenge the children of Israel of the Midianites. And it was the Midianites who helped to come up with this method of deceiving the nation of Israel. Go and avenge them. Well, we come down to verse 8 and we find the nation of Israel goes and kills the kings of Midian. And here's the 5 kings' names. And funnily enough, there's a man called Balaam. Balaam, the son of Beor, they slew with the sword. Now, how did they do that at the same time if Balaam went back home 500 plus kilometres back to Pethor? He didn't. He went back with those kings and he lived life with them in their ways, and that's what we want to see. And the result is he died. Yes, he enjoyed the pleasures of sin for a very, very, very short season, but he died as a consequence. How do we know that? From that battle, they kept some captives alive, and it was the women that they brought back. They were Midianite women that they brought back, the same women that had deceived those 24,000 brothers in Numbers 25, and they'd caused the children of Israel through the counsel, the strategizing, the doctrine of Balaam, who had taught them to commit trespass against Yahweh in the matter of Peor. And so the plague of Numbers chapter 25 and the whole story of Numbers chapter 25 is actually the counsel of Balaam. It is the work of Balaam. That's the end result of Balaam when it gets into our ecclesias. So we need to know how to deal with that. We need to know how to respond to that. And that's what we want to learn this weekend. So the story of Balaam, and let me summarise it this way, is right there on the edge of the promised land. And there's multiple times that his story is going to be referenced for us through the New Testament, or Old Testament and New Testament. But the same lessons is going to apply to Balaam that applies to you and I as we stand there on the edge of the kingdom. It's a warning for you, it's a warning for me in the same way. To choose to focus on what we want most, not on what we think we want because it's right here in front of us today. Focus on what we want most of a relationship with our God, our Father, of the kingdom, of being in that promised land, of beholding those lands, being there. And so that's what we want most. Get a clear vision of that so that what we think we want on a day by day, when it comes into our lives, won't have the same impact upon us. And it won't result in us giving up and running greedily after the same error that Balaam did for a reward.